Let your eyes grow heavy for a moment. Not too fast. Just let the weight of the day slide off, like a coat shrugged from tired shoulders. You're not here to work anymore. Not here to answer, perform, or prove. You're here to drift. And tonight we drift out to sea, far from traffic lights and phone screens, away from city clamor and restless clocks. There's a boat floating quietly on the dark Atlantic. It rocks softly in the swell, its wood old and bruised, its paint long since worn by salt and wind. You can't see the boat from shore, but it's there. In it, a man hunches forward, hunched the way his father hunched, and his father before him. His coat is heavy and smells of fish. His hands are cracked and stung with brine. His breath puffs in clouds, vanishing as quickly as it forms, lost to the night air. His eyes do not wander. They are locked on the sea. That man is a fisherman. And the sea, tonight, is silent. It's a kind of silence only the North Atlantic can offer. Vast, patient, thick with cold. The kind of silence that presses against your ribs and makes your ears ring. The kind of silence that remembers. This sea has buried 1,000 boats. It has seen faces twisted in frost and fear. It has kept secrets and swallowed names. But the man in the boat does not speak to the sea. He knows better. He only rows. You see, to be a fisherman here wasn't a career. It was a sentence, a kind of quiet punishment handed down from birth. Sinking time, the whole war. In those rugged coastal villages of Iceland, Scotland, Newfoundland, Norway, and the Faroe Islands, being born male often meant one thing. One day, you would go to sea. Not for glory, not for adventure, not for riches, just because that's what your hands were taught to do. Haul, gut, row, bleed, repeat. The Atlantic was never gentle with them. It lashed their boats with wind, gnawed their sails with ice, and crushed their bodies with work. But there were mouths to feed on land. There were ledgers to pay, nets to mend, debts to carry. And so, they went. In the stillness of this introduction, try to imagine that life, a world where time was marked not by hours, but by tides, where sleep came in fits, and food was never warm, where hands bled from rope burn, and where toes froze into numb stumps in the bottom of leaking holes, where the ocean itself, vast, unknowable, godlike, was both your wage and your warden. There was no heroism in it, just survival. Maybe that's what makes these forgotten fishermen so worthy of remembrance. They didn't write letters. They didn't give speeches. They just went to sea, again and again, until they didn't. And still, here we are, thinking of them, drifting backward into their world, where life was short, and courage never looked like courage. It looked like climbing into a splintered boat before dawn, teeth chattering, to pull up a net that might be empty, again. Tonight, in this quiet, we'll row through that life. We'll trace their footsteps across frozen docks and weeping shores. We'll feel the bite of the wind, the hunger of empty nets, the ache of superstition, and we'll ask, not harshly, not cruelly, but gently, why did they keep going? Was it love? Was it duty? Or was it just that they didn't know how to stop? You don't need to answer now. You only need to float with me for a while. Let the world of engines and glowing screens fade into the distance. Let the wind roll across your mind like soft sea foam across sand. Listen, there it is again. The creak of wood, the splash of oars, a voice, maybe yours, maybe his, humming something old beneath breath. No one hears the fisherman. But that's the point, isn't it? He was never doing it to be heard. He did it because the sea called, and no one else would answer. And now, as you rest, eyes warm, shoulders soft, we'll follow him. Not to glorify, not to mourn, but to remember. Welcome to the cold, hard, silent life of the North Atlantic fisherman, where the waves never loved you, but they never let you go either. The ocean doesn't scream when it takes something. It doesn't shout or weep or clamor for attention. It simply opens and closes. A splash, maybe, a creak of wood, A sharp snap of rope, then silence. A silence that never truly lifts. Not for the families on shore, not for the boys watching the horizon, not for the men who row alone. The ocean doesn't need to announce what it has taken. It just remembers. And the people who live by it remember too. For centuries, fishermen sailed into the North Atlantic, knowing that some boats would not return. Not, might not, would not, and still they went. Why? That's the question that lingers like salt on skin. Sharp, persistent, impossible to wash away. Why did they keep going? What pulls a man into a wooden coffin, day after day, knowing it may never float back to shore? It wasn't greed. Fishermen were rarely rich. It wasn't romance. There was no poetry in frostbite and rope burn. And it wasn't adventure. The sea did not thrill them. It wore them down, slowly, like waves shaping stone. No, the reason was far quieter and far heavier. They went because there was no other choice. On those wind-blasted coastlines, Nova Scotia, Iceland, Shetland, the Faroes, and coastal Norway. Fishing wasn't a job. It was the only thing left when the earth stopped giving. The fields were too thin, the soil too rocky, the winters too long. Nothing grew but the sea's patience. And so the sea became bread, fish became rent, salt became survival. There was no backup plan, no safety net. If you did not go out, your family did not eat. Your landlord did not wait. Your debts did not forgive. And so, at the first break of dawn, whether your hands had healed or not, you pulled on the same wet coat, stepped onto the same slick deck, and let the cold crawl back into your bones. There's something quietly horrifying in that kind of existence. Not in the storms or the drowning, though we'll speak of those, but in the way life shrank to a single rhythm. Cast, haul, gut, sell, cast, haul, gut, sell. There was no future to dream of, just the next catch. And even when the fish were plenty, there was the ocean tax, always the ocean tax. A torn net, a broken mast, a slipped hand, a man overboard. No moment was safe. Not when the wind turned sudden. Not when the ice grew sharp. Not even when the sun returned. Everything the ocean gave, it balanced with something taken. Sometimes it was just warmth. Sometimes a finger. Sometimes a brother. There are stories, quiet ones, that drift along those coasts still. Stories of men who stood waist-deep in freezing water to untangle a line. Of boys no older than 12 who learned to row before they could read. Of fathers whose boats returned one sail short, one seat empty. There are stories of towns that lost so many to a single storm that the church bells rang all day, and then again the next week. Yet still, they went. Was it bravery? No. Bravery implies a choice. This was obedience. Obedience to hunger, to tide, to the slow generational rhythm of endurance. And as we begin to drift deeper into their world, into the long hours and salted air, you may start to wonder what kind of men they were. Were they saints? Were they fools? Were they hardened or hollow? But those aren't quite the right questions either. You see, the fisherman was not some distant symbol. He was ordinary. A neighbor, a father, a son who never asked to inherit the sea, but did anyway. He was not remarkable for going. He was remarkable for coming back, again and again. Knowing exactly what waited beyond the horizon. Knowing the ocean was never grateful, but that's what makes his story worth telling. Not because it's glorious, but because it's forgotten. Because in a world that moves too fast, we forget how much of history was built slowly, by calloused hands, numb feet, and quiet desperation. The ocean took many things from them. Warmth, joy, time, names. But it could never take their persistence. And so tonight, as you drift into rest, we will remember them, not for their deaths, but for the way they lived in spite of them. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but with the slow, steady rhythm of oars in the dark. A man, a boat, a sea, over and over again. Before the rooster, before the bells, before the first light even dares to touch the edge of the sea, they are already awake. But this waking is not sharp. It is not a bright-eyed, stretching into the sky kind of waking. It's the slow, reluctant ache of eyes that open not because they want to, but because they must. The fisherman stirs in the dark. His back is sore before he's even sat up. His shoulders remember the weight of yesterday. His palms feel like bark, thick and rough with callus. And his feet, as he slides them into damp wool socks, do not recoil at the cold. They know it well. The room is small, a single plank floor, a thin mattress, maybe a child breathing softly in a corner, wrapped in wool and dreams. The wife is still asleep, or perhaps pretending to be. Either way, there is no talk. Words cost warmth, and warmth is already scarce. He finds his coat, the one he wore yesterday and the day before. Still damp, still heavy with the smell of fish, of sweat, of salt that never quite fades. He does not wrinkle his nose. There is no clean version of this coat. There is only worn and more worn. By the time he opens the door, the sky is still black, no stars tonight. Just a thick cloud cover that hangs like a wet blanket over the coast. The wind has teeth. It bites his cheeks, slaps his ears, finds the cracks in his scarf, and nestles into his bones. This is not unusual. This is normal. This is every morning. His boots crunch against frost that's crept across the path, past crooked fences and slumbering cottages, past the gutting shed where yesterday's stench still lingers, past a bent iron hook nailed to the post, where ropes dry stiff as iron. At the shoreline, the boat waits. Not a grand vessel, not a ship with sails and glory. Just a low, humble skiff, patched and painted too many times to remember its original color. One oar's been replaced. The net inside is frozen into folds, and yet, to him, it is both cage and cradle. Some mornings, another man is there already. His brother, his cousin, the neighbor who once lost a finger to a fish spine and never mentioned it again. They nod, but don't speak. Speaking is for later, for warmth, for land. Here, it is only breath and movement. He lifts the bucket of bait, still half frozen, and steps aboard. The boat shifts underfoot, water licking the sides with a soft, mocking hiss. He sets the net. He coils the line. He unties the rope from the dock, and for a brief, breathless moment, the boat floats free. Just him, the oars, and the great sleeping body of the sea. The rhythm of rowing begins. One pull, then another, wood scraping inside calloused palms, muscle remembering what thought has long since forgotten. The boat slides out into the gray. Behind him the shore disappears, first in distance, then in fog. The light has not yet come, but the work already has. Sometimes, in these quiet rows, he remembers dreams. Not bright ones, not golden horizon, endless opportunity kinds of dreams. Just warm bread, a new net, a winter with fewer coughs. Sometimes he doesn't remember dreaming at all. The sea is quieter now. No gulls, no waves, just a vast stillness that wraps around the small boat like a shroud. He rows past landmarks only he knows. Rocks shaped like wolves, a tree that leans like it's praying, a buoy that groans when the tide is high. To the outsider, it's a mapless stretch of water. But to him, it is a grid of hope and memory. He remembers where the fish bit last week, where they didn't, where the boat almost tipped, where his father once wept, and then slowly, the line goes in, fingers fumbling with frozen knots. The chill seeps through glove and skin, sinks into joints. He casts the net wide, not because he believes, but because he must. And then he waits, still, silent, watching the gray shift into something paler, not yet light, but not night either. The dawn comes slowly here. It creeps over the water, like someone apologizing. And when the first hints of gold touch the ripples, they reveal how hard the night has been. His face is chapped, his lashes crusted with salt, his clothes stiff with frost, his breath still visible in the air. And yet, this is only the beginning. There are still fish to haul, lines to pull, hooks to bite into flesh, knives to slice through scale and bone. But for now, in this first soft moment of day, the fisherman sits. He lets the wind talk. He lets the sea breathe. He lets himself exist. Not as a hero, not as a worker, but just as a man in a boat, waiting. Waiting for the sea to give something. Waiting for the weight in the net. Waiting for the next pull, the next hour, the next reason to keep going. And beneath it all, he knows tomorrow will look exactly the same. The darkness, the coat, the cold, the rowing, the silence. Because this is the life of the North Atlantic fisherman. Not loud, not romantic, not new, just old, cold, and necessary. The sea doesn't care how tired your arms are. It doesn't care that your back is sore from yesterday, or that your fingers cracked open while tying the last knot, or that you didn't sleep well because the baby was coughing and the roof leaked again. The sea does not care, and neither does the work. The oars are set aside now, and the net begins its silent descent. It unspools like memory, slow, wet, and frayed. With each pull of the rope, he feels the strain against the wood of the hull, the resistance of cold water swallowing his only chance at the day's wages. The net coils outward, disappearing into the deep, like a question whispered to a god who rarely answers. And then he waits. But it's not rest. It's not stillness. Even the waiting is work. He must watch, feel, know the water's mood by the way it presses against the boat's ribs, time the haul by instinct. It's not a science. It's experience. It's gut feeling. It's superstition. It's old advice from older men who died with nets still in hand. Then comes the first pull. He braces his feet, knuckles white around the wet rope. He leans back, muscles straining against the weight, not just of fish, but of weeds, debris, and sometimes nothing at all. There are good days when the net comes up heavy, full of herring, or mackerel, or cod thick with cold blood. Scales shimmer like coins in the weak light. There is relief, not joy, not celebration, just relief. The kind that lets a man breathe for one more week. Then there are bad days, when the net comes up limp and torn, seaweed tangled like hair, or worse, just silence, a void, an empty offering. Those are the days that truly hurt, not because of hunger, but because of effort wasted, because it cost the same rowing, the same lifting, the same cold, but it gave nothing. Today is somewhere in between. The net groans as it's hauled up, soaked and reluctant. A few fish, not many. Not few enough to despair, but not enough to smile either. He guts them quickly. Deft, practiced motions. No hesitation. Thumb behind the gill, blade through the belly. Innards spilled into the sea. Headless bodies tossed into the basket with a dull thud. The smell is sharp, metallic, salty. It clings to his hands, to his beard, to the inside of his nose. It becomes him. Blood freezes quickly in this air. It darkens around his fingernails, paints the edges of his sleeves. He wipes it on his trousers without thinking. The same trousers he'll wear tomorrow. This is the rhythm of the fisherman's day. Row, haul, bleed, repeat. There is no climax, no break, just the circling grind of hours. For do you work because that's what's between now and nightfall? Because time means nothing unless it's filled with labor. And the labor is not kind. Ropes tear at skin. Salt water seeps into cuts. Cold turns bruises into stiff blue patches. Some mornings, he doesn't feel his left hand until mid-afternoon. The fingers simply don't wake up with the rest of him. It's not frostbite, not yet. Just a numb warning, whispered from the edge of permanent damage. But there's no time to rest. The sea won't wait, and neither will the others. Another boat passes in the distance. A friend, maybe, or a cousin. What they lift a hand in a motion too tired to be called a wave. Just an acknowledgement. You're still here. I'm still here. That's enough. He watches them for a moment, just long enough to see the slump of their backs, the same stain on their coat, the same exhaustion in their pull. There's a strange comfort in knowing you're not the only one breaking. By midday, if the sun even shows, he's already hauled the net 4 times, maybe 5. His basket is heavier now. His arms shake with each pull, but the work hasn't slowed. He knows he has a small window before the wind turns, before the tide shifts, before the ocean changes its mind. He chews on a strip of dried meat, cold, hard, tasteless. It sticks in his teeth, washes it down with cold tea that's more leaf than liquid now. There is no pleasure in this meal, just function. Fuel. Enough to keep pulling. Fish slap against each other in the basket. Still twitching. He does not pause. He does not flinch. Death is part of the work, like water or rope. The fish die. The man works. That is the bargain. Sometimes a finger slips. A hook finds flesh. The blade slips on frozen scale. A cut opens wide. Bright, brief blood. And then the salt rushes in. It burns like fire lit inside the wound. But still, he works. He binds it with a strip of shirt, tucks it into a glove, and keeps hauling. Because to stop would mean the catch is lost. And lost fish mean lost meals. And lost meals mean explaining to his wife why the baby has less milk. So, he does not stop. And always, behind everything, behind the breath and the blood and the bone-deep weariness, there is the water. Watching, moving, waiting for him to falter. The North Atlantic doesn't roar all the time. It doesn't always send storms or scream with waves. Sometimes, it's worse. Sometimes, it's worse. Sometimes, it's calm, flat, gray, empty. A mirror of his fatigue. On those days, the work becomes harder because there is nothing to fight against. No wind to blame, no storm to curse. Only himself, his aching muscles, his quiet doubt, his fading warmth. And yet, the net still goes out because there is no other way. By the time the afternoon begins to dip, he has done the work of 10 men. He has rowed miles. He has lifted weights beyond reason. Holiday. He has fed the sea with sweat and blood, and he has caught just enough to try again tomorrow. No praise awaits, no applause, just the slow, weary row back home, and the knowledge that he will wake again tomorrow and begin all over. Row, haul, bleed, repeat, because this is what it means to be a fisherman in the North Atlantic. Not brave, not reckless, just enduring. There is cold. And then, there is this cold. Not the kind that makes you shiver and reach for a sweater. Not even the kind that stings your fingers and makes you rush back indoors. This cold lives deeper. It nestles into bone, coils around the spine, seeps through seams and into the joints. It is not felt on the skin, but beneath it, it becomes you, like breath or heartbeat. It is constant, unkind, and entirely unavoidable. The North Atlantic cold is a thing with teeth. It bites. Not once, not sharply, but slowly, repeatedly, like a creature gnawing on a bone. It works its way through you, hour by hour. At first, it's just unpleasant, then uncomfortable, then painful, and finally, numb. And numbness is not peace. It is a warning. The fisherman knows this. He knows the difference between regular cold and dangerous cold. He knows when his fingers stop bending properly, when his lips lose their words, when his boots feel like blocks of ice strapped to his legs. And still, he works. The morning began with frost, but now the wind has joined the day. It blows low across the surface of the water, peeling off waves into icy spray that smacks his face like handfuls of glass. The salt in the air cuts deeper in cold weather, sharp, dry, almost metallic. It lodges in his throat, sits heavy in his lungs. His scarf is soaked now, not just damp, but frozen into stiff folds. It crunches when he turns his head. His gloves, leather stitched with twine, are wet through. He wrings them out absently, knowing they'll be just as wet again in minutes. Every movement costs warmth, and the debt piles up with each passing hour. Cold wraps around his neck like a noose. It sneaks down his collar, crawls into his boots, slides up through the seams of his coat. His sleeves are stiff. The cuffs of his trousers are sheets of frozen wool. The little warmth he carries comes from movement alone. And even that, now, begins to fade. Sometimes he cannot feel the oars. He knows they're there. His arms are moving, but the sensation is gone. His hands are red, then white, then blue. He flexes them every few minutes to keep the blood moving. He knows a man who didn't. The man had rowed too long without pause, without gloves. The wind had been cruel that day, sharp as blades, and by the time he noticed, 2 fingers were black. A week later, they were gone, amputated on a kitchen table with a rusty blade and a bottle of spirits. No doctor, no compensation, just a quiet funeral for part of a hand. That story isn't unusual. It's just another warning written in salt. Every fisherman in the North Atlantic has cold stories. Not heroic ones, just awful. Lingering tales of frozen ropes that cut deeper than knives, of nets that stiffened into cages, of boots that trapped more water than they kept out, of hands stuck to iron tools, skin peeling off when pulled away too quickly. There is a silence to the cold that no one talks about. After enough hours in it, the body stops complaining. The shivers stop, but a pain dulls. What remains is a quiet heaviness, like sleep pressing against the edge of thought, a dangerous softness, a tempting calm. It tells you to sit, to pause, to close your eyes. Just for a moment. The fisherman knows never to listen to that voice. So he keeps moving. He shifts weight between his feet. He stomps the deck gently to keep his legs awake. He rubs his arms hard beneath his coat. He breathes through his nose to keep his chest from tightening. He does not stop, because stopping, in this cold, is surrender. The boat's floor is slick with frozen water. He has fallen before. A slip, a thud, a cracked rib that ached for weeks. But he kept going, because bruises heal. Frostbite does not. And the worst of it, it is never truly warm again, even in the cabin, even near the stove, even under blankets. But cold lingers in him like a memory. It fills his joints, stiffens his neck, settles behind his eyes. Some nights, he wakes shivering for no reason at all, just a dream of the wind, just the echo of that deep old chill. His wife says he smells like salt and ice, that when she holds him, he's always cold. Even in summer, even years later, but she still holds him, because she knows what he's endured. There is no protection against this cold, not really. Oilskins crack, boots leak, mittens fray. Fires on shore are brief comfort. The true cold stays with you, etched beneath the skin. It is not an enemy to be defeated. It is a condition to survive. And every man who rows into that gray horizon accepts that bargain. You will be cold. You will hurt. You will lose pieces of yourself. But maybe, if the fish are biting, you'll come home with just enough to keep going. Maybe that's why they don't talk about it. Because if they named it, if they really admitted how bad it was, they might not get back in the boat the next day. They might finally say no. And no man in the village could afford that. So they call it brisk, or sharp, or biting, but never cruel. They save that word for the sea. There's hunger. And then there's boat hunger. A kind of steady, gnawing absence that lives in the belly. Not sharp like starvation, but dull and constant. It doesn't make a man weak exactly. It just makes him forget what full ever felt like. Out on the sea, a fisherman never eats well. He eats out of habit, out of need, out of the faint hope that a crust of something will keep his knees steady during the next haul. There's no glamour to the food, no recipes passed down, or dishes savored. Only provisions. often packed in haste, always prepared in bulk, and usually stale before they're even unwrapped. He reaches beneath the bench of the boat and pulls out his ration bag. It's a cloth sack, stiff with salt. The drawstring's been tied and untied so many times, it's more knot than string now. Inside, the usual suspects: a piece of hardtack, a wedge of salt pork, a crust of blackened bread, and if he's lucky, very lucky, a small wrinkled apple, soft and brown at the edges. The hardtack is a cruel joke. It's more rock than biscuit, flour, water, and time. No flavor, no softness. You don't bite it, you gnaw it, you suck it, you wait for it to soften against your tongue, like you're trying to tame a stone. It tastes like dust and disappointment. More than one tooth has cracked on it. Still, it fills the space where hunger lives. And that's enough. The salt pork is worse. Ribbons of fat glistening in the cold, a texture that sticks to the roof of the mouth. Oddities. It's been cured so long it could survive a shipwreck. The salt is overwhelming. It doesn't season. It dominates. One bite dries the throat. 2 bites make the gums sting. He chews slowly, eyes squinting against the sun, or what little passes for sun in this gray sky, and swallows with difficulty. It tastes like work. It tastes like the sea. Sometimes, he remembers how his wife used to boil it with cabbage on Sundays, how the fat would melt, and the smell would fill the whole house. That same pork, treated with care, could almost feel like a feast. But out here, it's survival. The bread is hard, but edible. It's damp from the air, the crust cracked from cold. It crumbles in his hands and leaves grit between his teeth. He eats it anyway, quickly, before the wind steals it. And if the apple hasn't frozen through, he saves it. Not for later, but for last. It is his only reward, his only indulgence, a taste of sweetness in a world that tastes mostly of brine. There is no tea today. The flask is empty. The water turned long ago. What he has instead is brackish rainwater, caught in a tin, slightly metallic, slightly muddy. He sips it like a man would sip wine, grateful for the chance to moisten his mouth. His tongue, coated in salt and pork grease, stings. This is how a fisherman fuels himself. No warm soup, no hot coffee, no fire to thaw frozen fingers as he eats. Just the bitter wind, the smell of fish guts, the rocking of the boat, and the slow, mechanical motion of chewing. Even the timing of meals isn't right. You don't eat when you're hungry. You eat when the sea lets you. In moments between hauls, in minutes stolen from storms, in the precious windows, when both hands aren't needed, and the rope isn't pulling back. Food is not comfort. It is permission to keep going, and when it goes bad, as it often does, it's still eaten. He remembers once biting into a piece of bread, only to find it black with mold on one side. He tore it off, spit into the sea, and kept chewing. The rest was fine, or fine enough. Another time, the pork had gone sour in the sun. He rinsed it in seawater, salted it again, and gagged it down. A stomachache followed, but the hunger didn't. There are no replacements at sea, only trade-offs. And so the tongue adjusts. It learns to endure salt upon salt, to accept meat that bites back, to tolerate the chew of leather-dry bread and the occasional crunch of sand grit trapped in the net. Palate becomes habit. Habit becomes numbness. Some men, when they finally came ashore, couldn't taste anything for hours. They'd bite into roasted meat or soft eggs and feel nothing. Their mouths had forgotten softness, sweetness, flavor. One fisherman, long retired, used to say his tongue was made of fish skin and limestone. He wasn't joking. Even the smell of food becomes part of the sea. Fish, salt, rusted tin, cold meat. It all blends together in the air around him. He carries it on his coat, in his beard, beneath his fingernails. His breath smells like the boat. His sweat smells like the shore. And yet, he eats. Because without food, he cannot row. Without food, he cannot haul. Without food, he cannot return. The apple comes last. A small thing, bruised, mealy, but sweet, barely. He bites slowly, savors it as best he can, lets the juice sit on his tongue. For a moment, he remembers orchards, trees heavy with fruit, the crunch of a fresh apple, cold from the ground. Then it's gone, and the wind returns. There are still nets to pull, still hooks to set, still hours of labor ahead. He wipes his hands on his coat, ties the ration bag closed, sets it beneath the bench again. It'll wait for tomorrow, or the next day, when the same food, older, stiffer, saltier, will be asked to do the same job all over again. Out here, food is not life. It is merely delay, a way to pause the body's decline. The cold is still biting. The nets are still empty. The work is still waiting. So he picks up the oars and begins again. There is no calendar at sea. No Monday. No Friday. No weekend. No rest. Just tides and time. Just hunger and haul. For the North Atlantic fishermen, the week was not broken into days. It was carved by weather and dictated by fish. The rhythms of civilization, church bells, markets, Sabbath mornings, existed somewhere inland, in towns with steeples and clocks. But out here, on the waves, such boundaries dissolved like salt in water. There were only two measures of time: when the boat left, and when or if it returned. It didn't matter if it was Sunday. The sea did not care. If the waters were calm and the fish were biting, you went out. If the waves were merciful and the winds steady, you did not rest. Rest was not rewarded. Work was. Many were raised to believe in Sabbath law, in the sacred quiet of the seventh day. Their mothers taught them not to sew, not to sweep, not to whistle on Sundays. But their fathers, bent over nets, eyes squinting at storm clouds, taught them something else. God may rest on the seventh day, but the sea does not. So they worked, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with prayers, but always with the knowledge that stillness could mean starvation. The fish did not arrive according to Scripture. They came when they pleased, and when they came, you moved, quickly, without ceremony. Some men tried to obey the old ways. They would rest on Sundays when they could, light no fires, mend no nets. But those days were rare, and usually short. If the wind changed direction, or the fog rolled in, the rest ended with a call from the harbor. We're going. And when the call came, you didn't question it. You packed your salt pork, rolled your net, kissed your child's forehead, and went, even if your legs ached, even if your soul needed quiet, even if the last trip had nearly taken your fingers. Because fish didn't care about your need for peace. There were Sundays when boats didn't return. The church bells rang anyway. But not for celebration, for mourning. Funerals happened often. Some were quiet. A coat laid on an empty coffin, a name read from a damp piece of paper, a wife staring past the pulpit, a child looking at the floor. Then Monday came, and the boats went out again. One fisherman once said, "The sea never leaves room for grief, only space for work," and he was right. Even holidays meant nothing. Christmas morning might find a man gutting cod in freezing wind. Easter could fall during a storm haul, where blood and salt mixed with the memory of resurrection. Birthdays passed unmarked. Anniversaries were remembered only by the tide. Time itself began to fray at the edges. A man might work for 15 hours straight and think it had only been 8, or fish through what he thought was dawn, only to realize it was dusk. Sleep was fractured. Meals were guesswork. The sun did not always rise visibly, nor did it set cleanly. The clouds often blurred the sky into a dim smear of light and gray. And so, the body became the clock. Your arms told you when it was late. Your stomach told you when you'd skipped too many meals. Your eyes told you when they needed to close, if only for a moment. Even the return to shore was not always a full stop. Sometimes it meant unloading the catch, mending nets, counting coin, bartering, washing gear, and preparing to do it all over again. Sleep might come in stolen increments. An hour in the boat as it drifted back. A nap in the shed with your boots still on. A few minutes by the hearth before the next storm warning. No time for rest. No time for ritual. There were those who lost track of what day it was entirely. Old logbooks show notes like Still Tuesday, scrawled in margins. Letters home spoke of the 4th day since we last slept, or the 2nd trip this week, or maybe the 3rd, even time off, if granted, came with guilt. While one man rested, another went out and made a better catch. While one boat stayed in harbor, another returned full. Success bred pressure. Pressure bred sacrifice. One father once gave his teenage son a single rule. If you're warm and dry, you're losing money. He didn't mean it cruelly. He meant it honestly. Because there was always another debt to pay, another mouth to feed, another coil of rope to repair. And when death came, it often looked just like any other day. A trip that went long. A man who didn't wake up. A wave that came too fast. But there was no pause for mourning. The sea waited for no one. Neither did the markets or the empty cupboards back home. So the boats kept going, without clocks, without calendars, without rest. And still, somehow, they endured. Not because they were saints, not because they were strong, but because the sea had taught them a simple truth. If you stop moving, you sink. Returning home was never as simple as docking a boat. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't joyful. It wasn't even relief. Not exactly. It was quiet, slow, more like sinking into an old bruise than escaping danger. If the day was kind, and most days were not, the boat would find its way back to shore just as the light was fading. The sky turned the color of wet slate, the wind changed pitch, and the harbor appeared, not as a welcome, but as an obligation waiting to be met. There was always more to do. The catch had to be sorted, scales scraped, guts discarded, barrels packed and rolled onto carts, nets rinsed and hung to dry, if they hadn't frozen into stiff, useless slabs. Every movement was made with hands that had lost their strength hours ago. A man returning from sea did not come back whole. He came back diminished, used, frayed around the edges. And yet, somehow, that was when the hardest part began, because now he had to face his home. He climbed from the boat, legs trembling from hours of rowing and hauling, feet numb inside wet boots. The dock creaked beneath him, slick with seaweed and frost. Each step back toward the village felt heavier than the one before. It wasn't distance, it was weight, emotional weight. The weight of being a provider who might have nothing to offer. What had the sea given today? Enough? Not enough? And if not, how would he explain that? Some days, his wife met him at the door, not with open arms, but with eyes that scanned the empty basket. Not with anger, but with quiet understanding and quiet disappointment. She had counted on him, on the fish, on the silver coins that would buy flour or firewood. And when he brought little home, she didn't raise her voice. She just nodded and cooked what was left. Other days, the children rushed to the doorway, tiny voices calling his name, little feet slapping on cold floors. They clung to his coat, giggled at the smell, asked what he caught, and he, exhausted beyond words, forced a smile. He patted heads, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a shiny fish scale as if it were treasure. But the truth weighed behind his eyes. He knew he had failed to bring enough. Again, dinner on those nights was thin. Soup stretched with water, bread torn into smaller pieces, salt herring from 3 days ago, now fried dry to make it seem new. He sat in silence while they ate. His hands ached, his legs twitched, his mind buzzed with the rhythm of the sea. Even on land, the ocean followed him. It lived in the ringing of his ears, in the phantom pull of oars in his shoulders, in the dampness of his skin. Even when he sat near the fire, sleep came. Eventually, sometimes, he slept on a bench. Sometimes, still wearing his coat. Sometimes, not at all. There were nights when he simply sat by the hearth, staring into the coals, watching the orange light flicker like waves. He didn't think. He didn't feel, he just breathed, because that was all he could manage. He didn't speak of the things he saw, the net that came up empty 3 times in a row, the gulls that followed his boat, screaming, as if mocking him, the water that pooled in the bottom of the hull, more than there should have been. He didn't say how close he came to falling in, how long he hesitated before rowing back, how tempted he was, just for a moment, to let the boat drift. Instead, he grunted, said the catch was fine, said the sea was a bit rough, then closed his eyes, because in a few hours, he'd have to go back. That was the hardest truth of all. Home was never permanent. It was just a pause. The sea was the constant. The boat, the cold, the hunger, even the fire in the hearth was temporary. The warmth would fade, the wood would burn out, and morning would come far too soon. On some nights, the fisherman would reach out and hold his wife's hand, rough fingers brushing against rough fingers. No words. It was the only softness they had left, the only warmth not borrowed from fire or borrowed from hope. She knew he'd go again. He knew she'd wait again. That was the shape of their life, a long, slow oscillation between departure and return, between silence and silence. There were times when he brought home enough fish to smile, times when the children had full bellies, when the lantern burned longer, when laughter stumbled into the room like a forgotten guest. But even then, no one celebrated too loudly, because the sea was listening, and it did not like arrogance. So they thanked the fish. They scraped the bones clean. They salted what was left, and prepared to do it all again. Because being home was not freedom. It was just the space between the storm and the next tide, and in that fragile space, the fisherman slept, if only for a little while. Fog is not just mist. It's not a delicate curtain or a soft whisper drifting across a pond. It is a devourer, thick, wet, cold, a living thing with no face, no sound, no mercy. It arrives uninvited and closes the world. One moment, the fisherman rows beneath a pale sky, till he sees the water ripple, the coastline distant but visible, the rough shape of another boat on the horizon. The next, nothing. A gray so dense it feels solid, a wall that moves with him, around him, into him. His breath disappears the moment it leaves his mouth. The oars vanish below. Even the sound of waves seems to dull. He is not just alone. He is erased. The fog of the North Atlantic was feared more than wind or rain. Storms could be seen coming. They roared and flashed and warned. But fog? Fog slipped in silent, like a thief, and stole the world. It confused even the best. Sailors with decades at sea, fishermen who could row blindfolded, men who had memorized every rock and bend and curve of the coastline. All of them could be undone by 1 hour of heavy fog, because it doesn't just hide the world. It distorts it. Distances stretch and shrink. Sounds bounce back from nothing. A gull's cry feels like it comes from every direction. The slap of an oar echoes like a shout. The fisherman rows carefully now, each stroke tighter, shallower. His ears work harder than his eyes. He listens for water over rock, for a bell, for a voice, but all he hears is his own breath and the slow drip of condensation from the edge of the boat. His heart beats louder in this silence. It's too easy to imagine drifting off course, too easy to believe he's already gone too far. He turns slowly, trying to orient himself, but the fog offers no help. There are no markers, no stars, no sun, not even the faint glow of land, just gray. Soft, endless gray. He may only be a mile from shore. He may be 10. He may be rowing in circles. That's the danger. Some have done it, rowed in slow, wide spirals, believing they were heading home, only to drift farther out until the fog cleared and there was nothing but open ocean. Others have hit rocks they didn't see, splintered the hull, fallen overboard, been swept away without even a scream. Because in fog, no one hears you, and when the fog lifts, hours or days later, there is only an empty boat floating aimlessly, rope trailing behind it like a severed thought. Even when it doesn't kill, it terrifies. Men have returned from the fog shaking, eyes wild, unable to speak for hours, not because they saw something, but because they saw nothing. And the mind, when surrounded by nothing, begins to invent shapes, sounds, ghosts. There are stories of fog-born hallucinations, of boats with no oars, of voices that called out in the wrong tongue, of strange lights flickering deep beneath the water. The older fishermen don't speak of these things outright. They say things like, "Fog's not natural," or "it listens." They leave food on the dock some mornings. Salt, a piece of bread, a drop of rum, small offerings to the fog, as if to say, "Take this, not me." Even those who don't believe in superstition walk a little slower when the fog rolls in, because they know the sea is dangerous. But the sea in fog? That's when it's truly alive. The fisherman rows on, teeth clenched against the cold. His face drips with condensation. With his coat sticks to him, not from sweat, but from the wet air sinking into every fiber of cloth. His lantern won't light in this dampness. His compass, if he has one, swings uselessly in circles. And so he sings, a low, tuneless hum, not for comfort, but for memory, to remind himself he still exists. Some sing prayers, some sing old folk songs, some mutter the names of their children over and over, like a charm. Anything to hold on to something solid in this nothing. Eventually, if the fog is kind, it begins to lift. Slowly, edges fraying, shapes returning, light peeking through. First, the bow of the boat becomes visible again. Then the water beside it. Then, blessedly, a shape on the horizon. A tree, a house, a cliff, land. Only then does the breath return. Only then does the fisherman realize how tight his hands were gripping the oars, how shallow his breathing had become, how close he came to vanishing. And no one would have known. No grave, no goodbye. Just a man who went out and never returned. That is the power of the fog. Not its violence, but its silence. Not what it takes, but how easily it makes you disappear. You rarely saw them coming. Storms in the North Atlantic weren't always born in fury. They didn't thunder in like drummers with flags and banners. They crept, they stalked, they circled, just like wolves. The fisherman would glance toward the horizon and see it. Nothing, really, just a darkening edge, a shift in the clouds, a silence that came too suddenly. The wind would die, briefly. The gulls would vanish. And that's when the fear set in, because when the sea goes quiet, it's not peace, it's warning. Storms in this part of the world come with more than rain and wind. They come with anger, with intent. We're zuffed too fast, crashing across the water like a pack of hungry beasts. And when they come, there is nowhere to hide. The fisherman doesn't have a sturdy ship. He doesn't have shelter. He has a boat, a glorified cradle with a patched sail, soaked wood, and faith. He sees the storm coming, but it's already too late. The wind returns, angrier this time. It grabs the net and throws it sideways. It lifts the oars like twigs. It slaps his face, rips at his coat, howls in his ears. Then the rain begins. Not gentle, not rhythmic, but wild and loud, like pebbles thrown by a child in a tantrum. It stings the skin, it blinds, it soaks everything in moments. He tries to haul in the net. It fights him. The ocean has taken it and won't let go. His fingers slip, the rope burns. Something snaps. The waves rise, not gracefully, but violently. They slam the boat, lift it high, then drop it hard enough to make his spine jolt. Water rushes in. He bails with a bucket, but it's hopeless. The sea is faster, stronger, crueler. Thunder cracks, so loud it vibrates through his ribs. Lightning flashes, lighting up the ocean in ghost white, and for a moment, he sees himself, soaked, small, alone. The boat groans under the strain. Boards creak. Nails strain. Every wave threatens to break it in two. But still, he doesn't scream. There's no one to hear him. The ocean wouldn't care anyway. He rose somehow, not to escape, there is no escaping, but to stay upright, to stay steady, to stay alive. Storms arrive like wolves, but they leave like murderers, quiet, cold, and unconcerned. When the wind begins to slow, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a question. What did the storm take this time? He scans the horizon, if he can see it. No other boats, no birds, no sound, only wreckage, maybe. Floating wood, a torn glove, a basket of fish, spinning in the foam. He checks his net. It's ruined. He checks the hull. It's cracked. He checks his hands, bleeding again. And yet, he's still here. That's the strange thing about surviving a storm at sea. You don't feel grateful. You feel ashamed. Ashamed for the fear. Ashamed for the shaking. Ashamed for the moment you almost let go of the oars and whispered, "Just take me." Because the sea doesn't take with malice. It just takes. Not because it hates you, but because it doesn't know you're there. Men have drowned a mile from home, in sight of the lanterns in their windows, within earshot of their children's laughter. All it took was one wave, one shift in the wind, one moment of misjudged weight, and then they were gone. The survivors come home different, not broken, not loud, just quieter. They walk slower. They eat with more silence. They stare at the horizon longer, as if waiting for the next wolf to show its shape. And sometimes, they still go back, because that's the bargain. That's the life. The sea gives fish, and the sea takes men, and you never know which it will do today. There was no ceremony, no trumpet, no final word, no long echoing goodbye. Just a splash, a single, ordinary splash, like the sound of a barrel tipping or a fish returning to the deep. Nothing grand, nothing that would ever be remembered. This was how most fishermen died, not in blazing storms or sweeping tragedy, but in sudden silence, in an ordinary moment that turned sideways. One wrong tilt, one wave taller than the rest, one heartbeat of imbalance, and then over. Capsized. The boat, so familiar, so trusted, turned from cradle to coffin in seconds, its belly up, its ribs exposed, its nets floating like seaweed. The fisherman flung into water colder than fear, water that stole breath before he could cry out. Sometimes there was a shout, sometimes not even that. The water took him quickly, boots heavy, clothes soaked, fingers numb before they could claw, lungs tight before they could beg. The sea is a thief, yes, but it's also a magician. It knows how to make people vanish. There were no life jackets, no flares, no radios, only the slim hope that another boat might be near enough and fast enough to see it happen. But most capsizes weren't seen. They were heard about. A boat didn't return. The sun set. Families waited. Then the next morning, another fisherman found something. A net, tangled in the rocks, a hat, a name carved on an oar, and that was it. Capsized and forgotten, not because they weren't loved, but because the sea did not leave much to bury. Without a body, there was no grave. Without a grave, there was no closure. Only an ache that wandered through houses like wind beneath a door. Wives waited at the shore, long after they should have gone inside. Children stared at the empty chair during supper. Mothers lit candles and whispered prayers to saints who never replied. There was no list of names, no marble plaques, no monuments, just quiet, and the silence was heavy, because everyone knew it could happen to them, that their name too might be lost to the water, that they might be the next to vanish in a way so small, so fast, it didn't even make a wave. Some fishermen tied charms to their boots, a coin in the left sock, a carving of St. Nicholas on a string around the neck. Others carried nothing, no weight but their own. They didn't speak of the capsizes often. It was bad luck, or too painful, or too familiar. Instead, they said things like, "He didn't come back," or "We lost one to the tide," and that was all. One man, years later, spoke of watching a boat flip beside his own. He said it was quiet, terrifyingly quiet. One moment, the man beside him was laughing. The next, there was an upside-down hull and bubbles, and nothing else. No thrashing, no screaming, just a stillness. The sea, he said, closed like a door. Some who capsized lived, but rarely. If the water wasn't too cold, if the boat stayed close, if they could cling to something and hope someone saw. But even then, what waited was not warmth, it was guilt. For surviving when another didn't, for living when the boat shouldn't have let anyone walk away. And so, those men came back with hollow eyes, and many never went out again, or if they did, they never sang anymore. There is a story told among the old harbors about a man who capsized alone and lived. He washed ashore 2 days later, soaked and shivering, lips blue and hands curled into claws. They asked him what he saw. He said nothing, wouldn't speak, wouldn't eat, wouldn't fish again. Years later, someone found him walking the shore at dawn, whispering names into the waves. No one knew whose, but maybe that's what the sea does best. It takes names, not in malice, not even in hunger, but in forgetfulness. Because to the sea, every man is the same. Every splash is just water. Every capsize, just a shift in weight. But to the people left behind, those names meant everything. And now, they are only stories, scattered like driftwood, floating just beneath the surface. The cold could kill you without killing you. It could take parts of you, bit by bit, quietly. A finger here, a toe there, a patch of skin, a memory of warmth. The fishermen knew this. All of them did. They learned it not from books or lectures, but from watching, from the way a man shook out his hands too often, from how another stopped using his left thumb, from the discoloration, first red, then white, then blue. Frostbite didn't scream, it whispered. It crept in through soaked gloves, through holes in boots, through frayed sleeves and open cuffs. It waited until you were too busy, hauling, rowing, bleeding to notice. And by the time you felt it, it was already inside. Mornings were the worst, the kind of cold that cracked skin before the sun rose, where every breath hurt your teeth, where you couldn't tell if the sting in your fingertips was pain or the absence of it. They tried to stay ahead of it, rubbed their hands, stomped their feet, breathed into fists. Some tucked pebbles into gloves, warming them by movement. Others wrapped old rags around their socks, layering wool on wool, hoping the damp wouldn't win. But the cold always found its way in. A fisherman once said, "The cold knows your name. You don't have to invite it." They all had stories of hauling a net and finding they couldn't let go, of reaching into a basket and not feeling the fish move beneath their palm, of looking down and realizing their knuckles were black. They kept working because they had to, because there was no room for fear in survival, and because stopping was worse. One man, midwinter, pulled in a catch with bare hands. His gloves had frozen stiff and torn, so he worked gloveless. The fish scales sliced open his fingertips. The wind filled them with salt. By the time he docked, his fingers had turned a strange color, like ash soaked in wine. He didn't go to a doctor. There wasn't one. He didn't rest. He couldn't afford to. He just wrapped them in cloth and went out again the next day. By the following week, 2 of those fingers were gone. He joked about it, called them sea tacks, but his hands shook more after that. Frostbite was only the beginning. There were deeper colds, bone colds, mind colds, where your limbs slowed, where thoughts felt heavy, where decisions came too late. Men who stayed out too long returned quiet, their faces pale, eyes glassy, voices slurred. Some warmed up by the fire and returned to themselves. Others didn't. They said a man once fell asleep on the dock, just sat down and closed his eyes. They thought he was resting, but he never woke up. The cold, it turns out, is patient. It doesn't need to take you all at once. It will settle for a little at a time. A fisherman's body aged faster because of it. Their joints stiffened young, their spines curled, Their knuckles became gnarled and swollen like old roots. Some couldn't hold their own grandchildren without wincing, couldn't tie buttons, couldn't close fists. But none of them complained, because complaining didn't change the temperature. It didn't soften the wind. It didn't bring fingers back. So they endured. They adapted. They learned to bait hooks with 3 fingers instead of 5, to gut fish without thumbs, to row with elbows when the wrists gave out. Some days, the cold didn't feel like the enemy. It felt like the sea's memory, etched into their skin, because once it had taken something from you, it didn't give it back. They joked about it, sometimes. Didn't need that toe anyway. Good thing I've got another hand. But behind the laughter was a quiet truth. They knew the cold was always there, waiting, in the wind, in the water, in the boards of the boat, in the breath they watched leave their mouths. And yet, they kept going. Not because they liked it, but because stopping would mean surrender. And the cold would not stop. It was small, wooden, weather-beaten, held together by nails, pitch, and prayer. No bigger than a wagon, no taller than a man. And yet, it was everything. It was the deck beneath your boots, the walls that held off the sea, the surface between breath and drowning, the boat. To a North Atlantic fisherman, the boat wasn't just a tool. It was a second skin, a floating coffin you stepped into willingly every morning, knowing it might never bring you home. And still, you stepped in. Because without it, there was no income, no fish, no purpose, no hope. Most of these boats were passed down through families, father to son, scar to scar. They weren't crafted in great shipyards. They were built in backyards, hammered together with rough hands, bent nails, and salt-softened pine. Every scratch had a story. Every leak had a name, and every creak reminded you, this boat is older than your courage. It barely held together. The boards were warped from years of cold and swell. The seams leaked, always a little, even after fresh pitch was smeared along the cracks. The ropes frayed, the oars split. The sail, if there was one, was patched like a quilt made from wind and hope. Yet no one dared insult the boat. They spoke to it gently, treated it with respect, patted the sides when they climbed in, spat overboard if someone cursed near it. Because if the boat didn't like you, it would let you go. Some called them cradles, others wives. But all knew the truth that hung in every man's chest. The boat is your coffin, and one day it might close. Capsize wasn't the only danger. Sometimes the boat simply failed. A seam split, a board gave way, a wave landed wrong. The ocean came in, fast and unforgiving. Water pooled at your feet. The net floated. The bait box drifted. You bailed with a bucket. You prayed. You cursed. And sometimes you sank. Slowly, humiliatingly, within sight of land, within reach of help, but too far still. Because once the boat gave up, so did the sea. It swallowed you, not as a punishment, but as routine. Fishermen learned to listen for new sounds. A groan in the hull, a whistle in the planks, a softness in the oarlock. These weren't details. They were omens. One fisherman once said, "If your boat sighs, it's thinking about letting you go." So they mended, constantly. Every trip was followed by repairs, by hands rubbing oil into wood, by knees bent on damp planks, by a quiet conversation between man and timber. They couldn't afford new boats. They could barely afford pitch, so they used what they had: scrap wood, iron nails pulled from fences, bits of cloth sealed with wax. And still, they rowed, because the boat, for all its danger, was also a promise. This is how you feed your children. This is how you pay the merchant. This is how you survive. But that promise had terms. You gave the boat your back, your arms, your sleep. You gave it your youth. Sometimes, you gave it your friends. And sometimes, it took you. There were stories, always stories, of men found days later, curled in their boats, frozen stiff, of boats washed ashore empty, nets still coiled, lunch still packed, of wreckage found in the rocks, blood smears trailing across the stern. No sign of what happened, just a boat that decided to stop holding on. When a man died at sea and his boat came back without him, it was never repaired. It was burned, pushed out into the harbor and set alight, given to the water like a ritual. Not to honor the man, but to warn the others. This one failed. Don't ask why, just remember. Even the sound of a boat cracking became legend. An old man once said he woke from a dream with the sound still ringing in his ears, a snap like a gunshot, followed by rushing water. He went to the shore and found his brother's boat upside down. No storm, no fog, just a choice the sea made. The boat was light, almost weightless in the waves, but the silence around it was heavy. To be a fisherman was to accept this. You did not curse the boat. You did not blame the sea. You simply climbed back in the next morning. Because if you didn't, the house would be cold, the child would be hungry, the rent would be due, and the boat, for all its danger, was all you had. They didn't bury you in a churchyard. Not if you died out there. There were no headstones, no carved angels, no lines of mourners beneath trees, only the sea and silence. When a man died on the boat, everything stopped, briefly. The wind still blew, the waves still moved, but the men fell quiet. They looked at the body, sometimes in disbelief, sometimes with grim familiarity. A collapsed chest, a broken neck, a face gone still mid-sentence. Maybe he'd fallen. Maybe the cold had finally stopped his heart. Maybe he'd coughed one last time and gone still with the net in his hands. Death at sea rarely came with warning, and never with poetry. He wasn't a stranger. He was a brother, a cousin, a friend, the man who sang the loudest when the fish were good. And now he was still. They couldn't take him back. Not always. Not if the trip was long. Not if the body had already stiffened. Not if the boat was too small. A corpse adds weight. It throws balance. It draws in rot. So they made a decision. Not lightly, but with necessity. They wrapped him in sailcloth, tied with rope, sometimes with stones at the feet to make sure he sank. They said a prayer, or didn't. Sometimes they just muttered his name. One man said they'd whisper, "Go quiet, friend. Go home." Then with shaking arms and heavy hearts they lifted him. 1, 2, 3, over the side. And he was gone. No splash, just a soft sound, like a stone dropped into sleep. The sea took him back, as it always did. They watched the ripples fade, listened to the boat groan, and then they picked up the oars, the nets, the knives, because there were still fish to catch, still mouths to feed. The dead did not interrupt the tide. When they returned to shore, they said little. He's gone. That was enough. The families knew what that meant. They didn't ask for details. There was no body to dress, no face to see, no hand to hold, only a name, only absence. They grieved without closure, buried memories instead of bones. Sometimes they built a small cross on the dock, or scratched his initials into the oarlock, or left his boots by the door, untouched. But mostly they carried on. Because the next day, the boat went out again, and someone else sat where he had sat, and the water looked no different. That was the cruelest part. The indifference. The sea didn't mark the moment. No black ribbon on the waves. No chill of omen, just the same rocking. The same salt. The same rhythm, as if he had never been. Even now, in old stories, they speak of the sea as a graveyard, not lined with stones, but with silence, with names lost in the tide, with memories scattered like fish bones. One grandmother told her grandson, "When you hear the sea hissing at night, it's the voices of those buried beneath it." He believed her. Fishermen didn't fear dying at sea. They feared being forgotten. They feared the way the ocean swallowed not just the body, but the story. So they sang old songs, told tales of the ones who didn't return, passed down names like heirlooms. Because if the sea refused to remember, the people would. Even now, generations later, those names echo in coastal wind, in dockside silence, in lanterns left burning through the fog, and maybe, just maybe, when the waves rock soft and the stars hang low, the sea remembers too. But if not, we do. No one ever said it out loud, not in so many words. But every fisherman knew the ocean hated arrogance, not disliked, not resented, hated. It punished pride, mocked overconfidence, and dragged the bold down quicker than the careful. There were rules, unwritten but iron-bound. Never brag before a voyage. Never boast of your catch. Never mock the waves. Men who didn't return. It wasn't coincidence. It was justice. That's what they believed. Humility wasn't just virtue. It was protection. A fisherman who praised his boat too loudly would find a plank loosened. One who laughed at the storm would row against wind for hours. One who said, "I know this sea like my own hands," might soon be found holding nothing but water. So they kept their voices low, kept their hopes quieter. When they caught full nets, they said, "Better than nothing." When the weather was fair, they muttered, "Could turn at any time." Even in celebration, they tiptoed, because the sea, they said, listened, and it didn't forgive hubris. There were superstitions carved into daily life like the notches in the oars. Don't whistle on the boat. Whistling, they believed, summoned the wind, and not the good kind. A sharp gale, a sudden gust, a capsize waiting to happen. Never rename a boat. That was inviting disaster. Changing a name was like spitting on its soul. You erased its memory. And the sea, they said, would notice. Don't leave on a Friday. No particular reason why. Just don't. Boats that left on Fridays didn't come back. That was enough. Don't say certain words at sea. Words like drown, like last trip, like home. They were temptations. The sea might hear and respond. One fisherman refused to eat apples while on the water. Another carved a fish scale into every oar handle. Another wore the same cap until it rotted off his head. It wasn't about logic. It was about survival. And these beliefs weren't just old man tales. Young boys learned them early, from fathers, from uncles, from the way their names were whispered at the docks, from the sudden hush when someone crossed a line, from the look in a man's eyes when a friend was lost after breaking a rule. Even those who claimed they didn't believe acted like they did, because when the sea took someone, it didn't always make sense. Sometimes the weather was clear, the boat was sound, the crew was skilled, and still gone. So you had to believe something. If you couldn't trust science or chance or fairness, you trusted the sea's mood. And the sea, they said, was moody. It liked respect, quiet rituals, simple thanks. Some men tapped the boat's bow before every trip. Some kissed a silver coin and slipped it into their sock. Some drew crosses on the nets. Not for religion necessarily, but for safety. One old man poured a drop of his tea into the water before every trip. "Let the sea drink first," he'd say. Another hummed the same three-note tune as he rowed, claiming it kept the fog away. Some would tie small charms into the netting, bits of carved bone, braided twine, teeth of fish caught on a good day. It wasn't about magic. It was about balance. You gave the sea something, so maybe it wouldn't take everything. But it still did, sometimes. Even the cautious were punished. Even the reverent were dragged under. Because the sea didn't follow rules. It just reacted, and when it reacted, it reminded everyone why superstition mattered. Not because it changed the sea, but because it changed you. It made you slower, softer, more watchful. It reminded you that the line between life and death wasn't a cliff. It was a thread, thin, wet, fraying, and every act of humility was another hand holding that thread in place. The fisherman might not pray to God every night, but he never forgot to nod to the sea. And when he returned from a trip, cold, tired, alive, he whispered thanks to no one in particular, just in case something was listening. Because the ocean, they said, hated arrogance. but it sometimes tolerated gratitude. There are stories you don't tell during daylight, not because they're untrue, but because they're too true. Stories that drift, uninvited, from one harbor to the next, that ride the fog, that creep into nets, that hang around the edges of a cold morning like smoke that won't clear. The sea has always had its ghosts, and the men who work it know better than to laugh. They've seen them. Not clearly, not often, but enough to look over their shoulder after sundown, enough to whisper instead of shout, enough to know when not to ask questions. They speak of ghost ships, boats that float where they shouldn't be. No oars, no sail, no movement, yet somehow they glide, just beyond reach. You look once, and it's there. You look again, and it's gone. No sound, no wake, just the faint impression of something wrong. Some say they've seen boats with lanterns glowing, deep in the fog, bobbing in rhythm, but when they call out, there's no reply. Others have seen boats drift in, their decks slick with seaweed, barnacles clinging to the ribs like leeches. No crew, no markings, just emptiness. But the nets inside are full. Who hauled them? No one ever finds out. There are other tales, darker still, of boats that call for help in the middle of the night. Voices clear, desperate, human, shouting across the black water. Help us, over here. And when you row toward them, following the cries, the sea grows calm, too calm, and there's nothing there. No boat, no voice, no echo, just silence. And suddenly, your boat is farther from shore than you thought. Worse still are the bad omens, the little things. A gull circling the same spot, a net that knots itself, a sudden silence among the crew. One fisherman once said he watched a fish leap from the water and land in his lap, dead. Its eyes already glazed, mouth open in a silent scream. They turned the boat around that day. And 3 hours later, the wind changed hard enough to crack a mast. Another man claimed he dreamt of drowning the night before his brother died at sea. He said the dream felt wet, cold, too long. There are whispers about a woman who waits at the edge of the sea, always facing the water, never turning back. She doesn't move. She doesn't speak. She's not really there until she is. Men who've seen her say it's just before a boat is lost. Some even say they've seen her on the boat, standing calmly near the bow, dressed in black, hair like kelp, face pale as foam. They call her the Tide Widow. They don't speak her name after sunset. Even birds carried meaning. A crow on the dock was a warning. A gull that followed too closely was a spirit watching. A bird caught in the rigging meant someone wouldn't come home. Bad omens weren't always supernatural. Sometimes it was a coin dropped into the sea, or a knife falling point first into the deck, or a wave that slapped the boat sideways for no reason. They didn't shrug these things off. They adjusted course. They waited a day. They spat over the side and turned their shirts inside out, anything to shift the luck. Not because they were cowards, but because they had learned. The sea always noticed. And if you ignored the signs, you did so at your peril. Some even believed the dead returned, not as ghosts, but as omens themselves. A certain kind of fog, with a smell like lavender. A patch of calm water on a windy day. A fish with a mark shaped like a birth scar. All signs, all warnings. And yet, they kept fishing. They went back out, even after seeing the glow in the fog, even after hearing the cries, even after finding a boot, still laced, floating miles from land. Because superstition didn't stop the need to work. It only made the work quieter, more careful, less proud. Some men tied charms to their nets, not for luck, but to keep things out, to catch only fish, not memories, not ghosts. One fisherman carried a pocket full of salt and sprinkled it in the boat before each trip. Another muttered the names of his ancestors before casting the net, just in case they were listening. They never said they were afraid, but their hands shook a little more in the fog. And at night, when the fire burned low and the sea hissed against the shore, They sat in silence and listened. Not for gulls, not for weather, but for voices that didn't belong. And sometimes, just sometimes, they heard them. There were no priests on the boat, no steeples on the sea, no altars drifting among the waves, but that didn't mean the fishermen had no faith. They just kept it quiet, worn thin and folded small, like a letter tucked in a coat pocket. The sea didn't need sermons. It needed whispers. It needed gestures. It needed respect. So they prayed, not loudly, not always in words, but in glances, in touches, in repetition. Every man had his way. Some crossed themselves before stepping aboard. Some touched the water with 2 fingers and murmured names, saints, loved ones, lost friends. Some wore charms stitched into the lining of their coats, a carved fishbone, a lock of hair, a coin with a hole through it, passed down for 3 generations. These were not decorations. They were armor. You didn't show them off. You didn't explain them. You kept them close, like breath in winter. Some fishermen swore by St. Nicholas, patron of sailors and children. They spoke to him softly when the wind rose, left him bits of tobacco or bread, carved his symbol, a cross with 3 dots, into the bow of the boat. Others carried bits of blessed chalk tied in thread, believing it would keep fog at bay. A few said old Latin prayers passed down from monks, half remembered and badly pronounced. It didn't matter if the words were right. It only mattered that they were said, because silence, they believed, invited danger. Faith wasn't about belief. It was about survival. You needed something, someone to speak to, when the sky turned black and the compass spun, and when the sea opened up like a mouth, when the boat groaned like bone, when the cold made your hands useless. You needed to believe someone was listening. Some had tiny books, psalms, litanies, wrapped in oilskin and kept beneath the seat. Too wet to read, but still carried, their pages soft as seaweed from damp. Others tied their wedding rings to their necks, a reminder of land, of warmth, of home. They kissed them before casting off, touched them in the dark when the fog grew thick. A few had no objects, just habits. A man might murmur the same phrase every time he tossed a net, might look to the left first when rowing, might spit once over the side after catching the first fish. Was it religion? Maybe, maybe not, but it was holy in its own way. They didn't speak of these things to outsiders. They didn't talk about faith over beer or fishmongers' tables. They practiced it when no one was watching, when the wind blew sideways, when the stars disappeared. There were even prayers, they said, for the sea itself. Not to tame it, but to thank it, to ask for mercy, not control, because no one controlled the sea. You could only hope to pass through its moods without being broken. Children learned early. Mothers stitched tiny medals of saints into the cuffs of their sons' shirts. Grandmothers blew 3 kisses toward the water as the boats departed. Old women lit candles at cracked windows, facing east, and whispered over cups of salt water. Some said it was foolish. Others knew better, because when the ocean roared, even the skeptics found themselves speaking names they hadn't said in years. And when a man returned from a near capsize, from a night adrift, from a catch so good it felt like a gift, he didn't say, "I did it." He said, "Thank God," or "Someone was with me." That someone was rarely defined. Sometimes it was Mary. Sometimes it was a drowned brother. Sometimes it was no one at all, just a sense of presence, soft and unseen, and they clung to that, like a lifeline, like a second rope, because in a world of chaos, of crashing waves and blind fog and sudden loss, faith was the only thing that didn't rot, even when the nets tore, even when the mast cracked, even when the fish refused to bite. The prayers still worked, or at least they kept the heart beating. One man once said, "I don't know if God listens, but I do." He meant the act of praying was enough to stay steady, enough to feel less alone, and maybe that was the miracle. Not that the sea became calm, but that the man didn't collapse beneath it. Out on the sea, there is a silence that goes beyond quiet. It isn't peaceful, it isn't serene. It's the kind of silence that presses into the bones and rearranges a man from the inside. This was the silence the fishermen lived in, Not just for hours, but for days. They didn't talk much. There were no stories told over the nets, no laughter carried on the waves, no casual chatter above the splash of the oars. What little was said had purpose. Watch that line. Wave coming. Pull harder. Short, sharp, necessary. Words were tools, like knives or buckets, used when needed, put away when not. But because at sea, you conserved everything. Strength, food, and even language. Some men went entire days without speaking a full sentence, and when they returned to shore, they found their mouths didn't work quite right. One fisherman said he forgot how to speak softly. His voice came out like a bark, sharp, raw, unfamiliar. Another confessed that he stood in his kitchen after a trip, looked at his wife, and couldn't find the right word for soup. He pointed. She nodded, and they pretended that was enough. The sea made men quiet, not because it asked them to be, but because it taught them the cost of noise. Loud voices stirred gulls, startled fish, distracted hands. A shout in the wrong moment could mean a tangled net or a man overboard. So the silence became a companion, and in time, it became part of them. Some began to prefer it. They found it easier to be alone with the water than to sit in a room filled with voices. The ocean was hard, yes, but it didn't ask questions. It didn't need explanation. It didn't demand laughter. It only asked for labor. And labor, they understood. Others didn't fare as well. Some came back distant. They walked into their homes like strangers, greeted children with a nod, answered questions with a shrug. They weren't angry. They weren't sad. They were just blank, as if their minds were still bobbing somewhere past the harbor, as if the salt had soaked into their thoughts and made them heavy. A few forgot how to be gentle. They handled things. Dishes, tools, hands, as if they were still on the boat, firm, fast, unthinking. One wife said her husband came back rough around the edges, and rough all the way through. He wasn't cruel. He was just silent in a way that pushed people away. And some, especially those who fished alone, began to speak not to people, but to the sea. They'd mutter as they rowed, tell jokes to the gulls, whisper confessions into the fog. The line between solitude and madness was thin, and the sea didn't care which side you fell on. Men who fished too long without hearing another voice sometimes forgot their own. They'd stammer on land, or forget the names of things, or laugh too loudly at nothing. They weren't mocked, they were watched, because everyone knew it could happen to them next. Silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of emptiness. And when that emptiness stretches for miles, when the sky meets the sea in a quiet gray kiss that never ends, it begins to pull on the mind like the tide, relentless, inescapable. Some resisted. They carried harmonicas, hummed old hymns, tapped rhythms on the side of the boat, not for entertainment, but to remind themselves, I am still here, I still exist, I still have a voice. Because if the sea taught them anything, it was this. You could lose more than fingers to the cold. You could lose your voice to the silence. And once it slipped away, you might not remember how to get it back. Sleep was no refuge. Not for the fishermen. Not out there. Not after too many days at sea, even when they returned home. Even when their bodies collapsed into bed, stiff with salt, heavy with hunger. Their minds didn't rest. They drifted, back to the waves, back to the boat, back to the wind that never truly left their ears. Their dreams were not dreams in the soft, golden sense. They were soaked, sodden, slippery, filled with rope and water and cold. One man said he dreamed in gray. Nothing but the endless color of fog and sea and sky, blurring into one another. He would wake up gasping, hands reaching for the oar, feet kicking off the blankets like tangled net. Another dreamed of drowning, not once, but over and over. The same moment each time, a sudden slip, the plunge, the cold like knives and the slow sinking weight of water pressing against his chest. He'd sit bolt upright in the night, soaked in sweat, certain he hadn't survived. And maybe, Part of him hadn't. There was a kind of seasickness of the soul that came not from the water, but from sleeping after being too long upon it. It lingered. You'd hear the waves even in silence. You'd feel the boat rock when lying still. You'd smell salt in the walls of your own house. It followed you, crept under your door, curled in the corners of your room, and when you closed your eyes, the sea found you again. But it wasn't just the sea. Sometimes the dreams brought faces. Men who were lost, hands that slipped, voices that called out but were never answered. They visited without warning, smiling sometimes, other times pale and swollen, with eyes that didn't blink. The mind, the fisherman knew, held on to things the sea tried to take. Grief, fear, guilt. And the dreams dredged them up like forgotten anchors. A few men tried to drown the dreams with drink. Rum, ale, whatever numbed the sharp edges of memory. But alcohol, like the sea, gave no guarantees. Sometimes it dulled the night, other times it sharpened it, turned sleep into a cinema of pain, vivid, loud, drenched in salt and sorrow. Some wives said their husbands cried in their sleep. Others thrashed, shouted, called out names that hadn't been spoken in years. One woman said her husband woke in the middle of the night, picked up a chair, and hurled it across the room, still dreaming he was fending off a wave. He had no memory of it in the morning. He just sat on the edge of the bed, silent, head in his hands, and said, "I thought I made it home." But some nights, some rare nights, there were different dreams, gentler ones, of still water, of full nets, of warmth, of standing barefoot on the shore, the sun low, the boat tied up, and no need to go back. They didn't talk about those dreams either, because they were fragile, like foam, gone with the morning, and maybe that was the hardest part. Not the bad dreams, but the good ones, the ones that reminded you of what peace could feel like, if only for a moment, because the morning always came, and the sea always called, and the dreams, no matter how warm or cruel, faded like breath on cold glass. So the fisherman learned to sleep carefully, to hold his rest like a bird in the hand, lightly, gently, ready to let it go. He never expected peace, only pause, because even in dreams, the sea was never far behind. You might ask, quietly, gently, after all this, why? Why did they still go back? After the capsized boats, after the frostbitten fingers, after the silence and salt and loss and long gray dreams. Why climb into that same boat again and again, knowing it might never bring you home? The answer was never just one thing. It was 1,000 quiet truths, stacked like stones. The most obvious was need. Not hunger for adventure, but literal hunger. The sea fed them, not metaphorically, not spiritually. Literally, it paid the rent. Barely, it filled the stew pot, some days. It bought boots for the children, thread for mending, bread when the oven sat cold. There were no other options. The soil was poor, the land unforgiving, the world too far and too rich to care. So the men fished, because it was the only path forward that didn't require permission, didn't require schooling, didn't require land or favor or fortune, only a boat, and the willingness to suffer. But beyond need, there was something else, inheritance. Most of them had fathers who fished, grandfathers who fished, lines of men stretching backward, bound together by nets and oars. You were taught the sea before you could walk straight, taught to listen to the wind, to know the taste of salt, to tie knots before you could write your own name. It wasn't just a job, it was identity, a lineage carved into hands and backs, and silence. To abandon the sea felt like betrayal, betrayal of family, of village, of self. And so, even when the money was bad, even when the catch was small, even when the dreams turned dark, they went back. But maybe there was something deeper still, a reason they couldn't put into words. The rhythm, the oars in the water, the call of the gulls, the creak of rope, the slap of wave. The sea became part of them, Its vastness offered something the land never did: honesty. There was no flattery on the sea, no gossip, no pretense, just weather, work, and the thin line between breath and stillness. Some men found peace in that. Not joy, not exactly, but clarity. On land, they felt crowded, out of place, like animals in too small cages. But on the water, even in the cold, even in the danger, there was space. A strange freedom wrapped in hardship. The boat may have been a coffin, but it was theirs. They knew every board, every leak, every sound it made in sleep. Some men couldn't imagine not fishing, not because they loved it, but because they didn't know who they were without it. They feared the stillness of land more than the chaos of the sea. And perhaps, quietly, there was something else, a kind of defiance. Every trip was a victory, every return a quiet rebellion against the odds. They'd stand on shore, salt in their beards, blood on their hands, backs aching, and they'd say without words, "You didn't take me this time." And the sea would answer with silence. There were those who left, moved inland, found work in factories or mills or far-off cities. Some did well, sent letters, built lives without nets. But many came back, or wanted to, or dreamed, until their last breath, of the taste of brine and the weight of the oar. Because even in its cruelty, the sea gave them something nothing else could: purpose. Not in glory, not in fame, but in persistence. The sea didn't care about your name, your dreams, your prayers. It only cared if you could endure, and they could, so they did, over and over, morning after cold, gray morning, until one day they didn't. And even then, the others went back, not for love, not for hope, but because it was what they did. And because somewhere deep down, beneath the cold and callous and silence, they knew one final truth. The sea took much, but it gave them themselves. Before the first oar touched water, before the nets were coiled, before the cold wind bit the ears and stiffened the fingers, the fisherman was already in debt. Not because he was reckless, not because he was wasteful, but because the system was built that way. It was a quiet trap, one made of paper and promises, and salt. To fish, you needed gear, lines, hooks, bait, barrels, salt for preserving, a knife for gutting, maybe oil for the lantern, maybe pitch for the boat. And unless you were rich, which none of them were, you bought those things on credit, from the merchant, or the boat owner, or the supplier who lived one road above you. They kept ledgers, neat, tight rows of names and numbers. Every rope, every nail, every scrap of salted pork you carried aboard was added to your page. And when you brought your fish back to shore, when your hands were raw and your face windburned, your catch went not into your own basket, but onto the merchant's scale. He weighed it, nodded, jotted down a number, then subtracted your debt. The result? Often, almost nothing. A few coins, maybe a loaf, maybe enough to cover what you now owed for the next trip. It was called the truck system in some places. Elsewhere, just the way things are. You didn't get paid in cash. You got paid in credit at the merchant's own shop, which meant the same man who bought your fish sold you your flour, your boots, your candles, your hope. The prices always favored him because he held the pen and you held the net. It was a form of economic quicksand. The harder you worked, the deeper you sank, because every extra trip meant more bait, more wear on the gear, more salt, more credit, more debt. One fisherman once said, "I'm not fishing for my family. I'm fishing to pay for yesterday." And he wasn't exaggerating. Some men tried to escape it. They saved scraps of coin, bartered with neighbors, built their own hooks, dried their own bait. But even then, there was always something they needed, and the merchant waited with open hands and a ledger that never forgot. Some merchants weren't cruel. They weren't villains. They extended credit with kindness, knowing the fisherman would never truly catch up. Others were ruthless. They tightened the noose with interest, held debts over families, took boats, took homes. The worst kept tally sticks, notched pieces of wood, each mark a debt. And if a fisherman died owing too much, they'd pass that stick to his son. It wasn't legal, but it was understood. Debt was inherited, like nets, like silence. The village knew, but what choice did they have? No fisherman had savings. No fisherman had time to argue numbers. You went out to sea so you could return with something, even if you knew most of it wouldn't be yours, even if the coins that did find your hand slipped through it like water. And always, the boat called again, not with promise, but with obligation, because the debt didn't wait. The merchant's books never slept, and the sea, as always, offered no forgiveness. It was a cruel kind of comedy. The fisherman who risked his life, who rode into storms, who froze his fingers, who buried his friends at sea. He came home thin, hollow-eyed, barely scraping by. While the merchant, who stayed warm by his fire, who walked with clean boots, who never touched a net in his life, he grew fat, his belly stretched tight under his coat. His boots were leather and dry, his coat lined with wool, his house set just high enough to look down on the harbor. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to threaten. He simply held the scale and smiled. It was the scale that decided who ate. You'd come back with a boat full of fish, your hands bleeding, your back bent, your eyes red from salt and wind, and he would weigh the catch. Not as much as last time, he might say, or the salt's too thick, or prices are down this week. Then he'd write a number, subtract your debt, hand you a coin or two, and just like that, your week was gone. He'd take your fish, salt it, pack it, sell it across the water to cities you'd never see, where people who never smelled the sea dined on your labor, called it fresh, called it delicacy, paid full coin for every bite, and the merchant pocketed the difference. He'd sell barrels of your cod to wealthy traders, then sell you boots made of poor leather, sell you bread made from the cheapest flour, sell you knives that rusted within weeks. He controlled the whole loop. You caught the fish. He made the profit. You risked your life. He built his walls higher, even when the fish were good. When the boats came in heavy and the village sang for a night, he'd say the price had dropped. Too many fish on the market, couldn't pay full rate. Then, weeks later, when the sea was quiet and no boats returned full, he'd say, bad season, can't offer much for a light haul. It was always in his favor. The fishermen knew this. They talked about it in whispers, over mugs of cheap ale, beside the boats at dusk. But what could they do? He owned the ice, the salt, the barrels, the ledgers, and worse, he owned the buyers. The outside world didn't want to deal with a fisherman. They wanted men with wax seals and fine words, men who had offices, ledgers, scales. So the fishermen kept fishing, because hunger didn't care who was fair, because debt didn't wait for justice. Some merchants grew so rich they bought land, built church benches with their names on them, paid for bells to ring in their honor. And the fishermen listened to those bells, cold and tired, wondering if the man they honored had ever once touched the sea. Some said the merchants weren't evil. They just did what the world allowed. They played the game better. Maybe, maybe not. But the result was the same. The fisherman starved. The merchant dined. One man once said, I watched my fish sail off to feed strangers, while my child went to bed without soup. That was the weight of it, not just labor, but loss. The fisherman didn't just lose money. He lost ownership of his own work. He gave everything to the sea, then gave what was left to the merchant. And in the end, there was nothing for himself. Not even thanks, because the merchant believed he was doing them a favor. Where would you be without me? He asked once. The answer came in silence, because the truth was too painful, and the sea, as always, did not answer. You didn't choose to be a fisherman. It chose you. Or rather, your father did, and his father before him. It was in your boots before you could tie them, in your fingers before they were strong enough to hold a net, in your lungs before your voice deepened. The sea was your inheritance. Not land, not money, not freedom. Just the boat, just the trade, just the silence. From the moment a boy could walk, he followed the rhythm, down to the dock, over to the bait shed, out onto the slick planks of the harbor. He learned how to coil a rope, how to watch the sky, how to stay still when a knife passed close. His first lesson wasn't in words, it was in watching. The way his father mended nets, the way his uncle spat over the left side of the boat before casting off, the way no one ever said goodbye before a trip, just a nod. There was no ceremony, no now you are a fisherman moment, just a day when someone handed you an oar and expected you to use it. Even those who dreamed of something else, school, carpentry, trade, travel, knew that dreams didn't feed families. The boat did, so they climbed in. First as a helper, then as a rower, then one day as the man at the helm. And that was that. You didn't talk about leaving. Not seriously. You might joke, after a long trip or a lost catch, that you'd run off to a city, work in a shop, sell cloth, or cut hair, or sweep floors. But those words always faded, because the boat was waiting. The nets were drying, and your father, old, tired, hopeful, looked at you with the same eyes his father once used, and you couldn't leave him. There was pride in the trade, yes, but also pressure, unspoken, heavy, constant. If you didn't fish, who would? What would your name mean? What would you be? Sons didn't inherit houses, they inherited burdens, and the burden was quiet, rough, cold. It came in early mornings, in the weight of a gutted cod, in the ache of shoulders before noon. Some rebelled, ran off. They made it as far as the next town, a city, maybe, found work, wrote letters home. Brief, proud, then less frequent, but most came back, or wished they had, because even as cruel as the sea could be, it was familiar. It was theirs. The world beyond the coastline was stranger than the fog, and lonelier. Back home, even in silence, you belonged, and so the trade continued. A son watched his father's hands grow stiff, saw the cuts take longer to heal, watched him pull in the net slower each season, and without needing to ask, he stepped forward. Because it was time to shoulder the same work, to speak to the sea in the same way, to nod instead of saying goodbye. And one day, he'd have a son of his own, a boy with wide eyes and strong legs, a boy who would learn to gut fish before he could write his name. And the cycle would begin again, not out of cruelty, not even out of tradition, but because there was no door out, no other map, no safer shore, only the boat, and the boy who would one day learn to row it. When a fisherman got hurt, no one came running. There was no sick leave, no compensation, no forms to fill, no clinics to call. There was just the pain. And the sea, still moving, unimpressed. Injuries were not rare. They were expected, as common as salt and rope. Hands got sliced, shoulders dislocated, knees tore, fingers broke and stiffened and healed wrong. Bones set themselves while the man kept working. No one rested. Rest was for the rich or the dead. If a man crushed a finger pulling in a tangled net, he'd wrap it in cloth, bite down, and keep hauling. If he slipped on ice, bruised his ribs, tore his wrist, he rowed with the other arm until the pain dulled, because there was no one to take his place. And the fish, they didn't wait. The tools were sharp. The work was constant. The decks were slick with blood, scales, seawater, and ice. Even standing was dangerous. One wrong step, and you hit the deck hard, skull on wood, mouth on metal, ribs cracking like dry twigs. A man who fell overboard and survived, cold, coughing, shaking, was back on the boat the next day. What else could he do? His family needed him. The debt wouldn't pause. And the sea never said, "Take your time." When a man lost a finger, there was no doctor to stitch it clean. Just hot water, rum, rags boiled in salt, a friend with a steady hand and a dull blade, some lost toes. Others walked with limps that grew worse with every winter. Backs bent, joints swelled. They aged fast. By 40, many looked 60, hands curled into claws, knees clicked with every step. They didn't complain. Complaining didn't feed your children, didn't patch the boat, didn't pull the net from the water. So they endured. Pain was private, wrapped in silence, hidden beneath layers of wool and resolve. Wives knew better than to ask. They saw the winces, heard the groans at night, noticed when he could no longer lift the youngest child, but they said nothing. Because if they named it, if they said, "You're broken," he might stop. And stopping, in this world, was a kind of death. There were no pensions, no safety nets, no retirement. You worked until your hands no longer opened. And even then, you found ways to keep moving. One man, too weak to row, became the net mender. He sat in the shed, bent and blind in one eye, fingers trembling, but still useful, still part of it, because being useful was the only armor against being forgotten, and forgotten was worse than pain. So injuries piled up, in the spine, in the knees, in the quiet corners of the body, and one day the man didn't get up, didn't step onto the boat, didn't answer when called. Not from laziness, not from illness, just from years, years of wounds that were never allowed to heal, years of being broken but never stopping, and the sea, as always, didn't notice. You might imagine that a man who spent his days hauling fish from the sea would eat well, that his table would be heavy with cod, his stew thick with shellfish, his bread dipped in fat and salt. But that was a fantasy, a postcard dream, sold by people who had never stood barefoot on a cold dock at 4 a.m. Because the truth was this: the fisherman often couldn't afford the very food he caught. He pulled the fish from the ocean, bled them, gutted them, dragged them ashore in barrels sticky with brine, and watched them carted off to market for someone else's dinner. He could not eat what he caught because it didn't belong to him. By the time he paid the debt on bait, the cut the merchant took, the salt tax, the dock fees, there was nothing left. So his family ate scraps, not cod fillets fried in butter, but bones, tails, pieces the merchant didn't want. Some families boiled fish heads, pulled flesh from jaws and cheeks, used the leftover broth for days. Lobsters? Today, they're a delicacy, a luxury for cruise ships and white tablecloths. But back then, lobsters were considered garbage food. Sea insects. They washed up in tide pools, crawled in traps meant for better catch. Poor families ate them when there was nothing else. Some children were ashamed to bring lobster sandwiches to school, and still, it was more than many had. On hard weeks, the dinner was bread soaked in fish stock. On harder weeks, bread alone. Some grew gardens to stretch their meals. Others kept chickens for eggs, or goats for milk. But these were luxuries in their own way, and not always possible when the wind snapped fences and salt burned the soil. The irony never escaped them. They fed the cities. They filled the tables of politicians, judges, and traders. In Boston, in London, in Paris, men feasted on their labor. They ate cod with lemon, sipped wine between bites, never thinking once about the man who had nearly died to bring it ashore. But the fisherman knew. He knew when his child went to bed with only half a bowl. He knew when his wife stretched flour with water and lies. He knew when his belly growled louder than the storm outside. There were days he returned with no catch, days when the sea offered nothing, and the fire in the hearth grew weak with embarrassment. And yet, he went back, 'cause maybe the next haul would be better. Maybe he'd bring home enough to keep the stew pot full for 3 nights instead of 1. Maybe he could keep the merchant's balance in check. They counted potatoes, rationed salt, measured oats by the fingerful. This was not starvation. Not always. But it was hunger, persistent, lingering, daily, a kind of hunger that taught you to be quiet at meals, to thank the crumbs, to chew slowly so it lasted. Some fishermen joked that their best meals were the ones eaten on the boat, a stolen bite of salt pork, a piece of dry biscuit shared with a friend, hot tea from a battered tin cup that smelled of fish and rust. Because out there, even meager food tasted like something earned. On land, it often tasted like shame, but they ate anyway, because work made the food sacred, and sharing made it enough, even if it wasn't. It always started small. A torn sail, a broken oar, a bad haul, a child who fell ill. 1 week without income, then 2, then a month when the catch was thin and the debt grew thick. The merchant's face changed. The kindness faded. He stopped saying next time and started saying you're late. And just like that, the line snapped. Because this economy wasn't built for mercy. It was built for movement. And when a man slowed down, even for a moment, the current swept him under. Some tried to borrow from neighbors, but everyone was poor in the same ways. The same holes in their boots, the same cough in their lungs, the same fear behind their smiles. You could trade fish for bread once, twice maybe, but soon the bread was gone too. Others sold tools, the spare net, the good knife, a warm coat. They promised they'd buy them back when things got better. Things rarely got better. Some begged the merchant for leniency. He'd sigh, look at his ledger, tap the ink dry on the edge of the table, then offer a deal, a cruel one. Lower prices for your catch next week in exchange for a little extra flour now. A month of deeper debt in exchange for salt and soap. A favor that felt like drowning in slow motion. And still, they took it. Because children needed to eat. Because pride was a luxury. Because hope was the only thing cheaper than fish heads. And when hope ran out, the boat was sold. The family moved inland, where the sea couldn't see their shame. The man took work on someone else's land, harvesting grain with a back that still remembered waves. Others stayed, bitter, tired, silent. They mended nets they no longer used, watched younger men take their place on the boats, listened to the gulls, and remembered a time when their name meant something on the dock. Wives stitched clothes from scraps. Daughters went without shoes. Sons grew up knowing hunger, not as tragedy, but as a familiar companion at the table. And the merchant, he remained, warm, comfortable, untroubled, because the sea may have chewed up men, but it fed commerce, and commerce did not grieve. And when a fisherman's debts finally overtook him, when his nets were rotted and his boat gone, he didn't curse the sea. He cursed the numbers, the quiet, inked numbers that ruined lives more efficiently than storms. It was never a dramatic collapse, just a slow, grinding erosion of strength, of savings, of dignity, until one day you were no longer a fisherman, just a man who used to fish. And the sea, as always, didn't notice. Let the water calm now. Hear it hush against the harbor stones. A slow, sleepy sigh after the long telling of a hard life. You and I have rowed together for hours tonight, through black glass dawns and storms that bit like wolves, past the fog that erases horizons, into the hush of cramped cabins and the wider hush of empty dreams. We have tasted the brine on rotten rations, felt fingers stiffen with frost, watched boats turn from cradle to coffin, and heard ledger pages snap shut like iron gates. So rest here a moment, feel the boat settle, let the oar slip loose from your hand and float beside you. A single strip of wood rocking on gentle ripples. Every story has a pulse. This one beats slowly, heavy, deliberate, like a heart wrapped in wool and salt. It reminds us that history is not only forged in palaces and parliaments, often it is hammered out in invisible places by invisible people whose names fall between the cracks of ledgers and perish books. A North Atlantic fisherman rarely etched his own story in ink. He etched it in scar tissue, in calloused palms. in planks darkened by years of spilled blood and rain. Yet those silent marks shaped whole nations, fed distant armies, broadened city markets, salted the winter larders of strangers he would never meet. The world swallowed his labor and forgot his face. But the waves, all those billions of restless breaths, they remember the rhythm of his oars even now. Think of how neatly museum charts track shipping tonnage, export graphs, cod weight curves. They look clean, efficient, inevitable. But every tidy rise on those lines hides a man bent double in sleep, a woman stretching soup with water, a child tracing frost on a window while waiting for a lantern to bob into view. Numbers smooth out the ache. Tonight we peeled those numbers back and felt the raw skin underneath. We heard boots squelch on icy boards, heard lungs seize in sudden fog, heard a ledger's scratch decide whether a family would eat. And in doing so, we brushed against a deeper truth. Progress is often mortared with lives that never get listed in the credits. Yet there is something else here. Call it perseverance, call it duty, call it love thinly disguised as habit. Whatever name you choose, it carried men back onto the water every pre-dawn, long after sense suggested they should turn inland and forget the ocean. That ember lives on, not just in seaside villages where gulls still scream over empty piers, but in warehouse night shifts, in delivery vans before sunrise, in every quiet corner where people trade comfort for necessity. We inherit more than eye color and surnames. We inherit rhythms, the discipline of rowing, even when your muscles shake, the reflex of laughing softly when luck finally tilts your way, the instinct to share a crust of bread because hunger tastes less bitter when divided. So what do we do with all this salt-drenched memory? We can let it rock us towards sleep, a lullaby of distant gulls, wood creaking, and waves brushing star-stippled hulls. Or we can let it nudge us awake, just enough to notice the unseen labor around us now. Tomorrow, a cashier will rub an aching wrist after scanning groceries for 10 straight hours. A janitor will wring out a mop before dawn, while office lights still blink in screensaver blues. A driver will guide a rattling bus through rain so strangers arrive at warm kitchens without thinking how they got there. Their work may not smell of cod or bite like North Atlantic wind, but it is kin to those forgotten fishermen. Necessary, uncelebrated, quietly heroic. Before we leave this boat for good, picture one last scene. A single oil lantern swaying on a hook at the prow, throwing a thin circle of gold across black water. Inside that light, you see calloused hands resting, the sea finally calm, and beyond the rim of brightness, endless dark, endless unknown. The lantern's glow is small, yet it is enough to row by, enough to find the next heartbeat of work, enough to promise, softly, stubbornly, that morning will come. Carry that lantern with you as you drift into sleep now. Let its flame remind you that even the faintest warmth means survival, that every unnoticed laborer threads a stitch through the vast fraying quilt of the world, that endurance itself can be a quiet form of grace. Close your eyes. Feel the boat's gentle sway, slow to a cradle rock. The tide hums low. The gulls have folded their wings, and the wind, ever wary of arrogance, has softened into a lull. You are safe on this shore between waking and dreaming, listening to the hush that follows toil, the hush that honors names the ledgers left out. Sleep now while the salt air settles. Sleep and let the waves keep watch, for tonight at least, the sea is calm, and somewhere in its dark, patient heart, it carries the echo of every oar stroke that ever was.